I hope I didn't keep you waiting for too long, because it's time for every episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic Season 3 Revisited. In this show's entire 9-season run, this is the only season that is only 13 episodes long. The finale of this season, Magical Mystery Cure, marking where I believe this show starts getting really interesting. Some of you who may have been around this channel for long enough may also be aware of the fact that I originally never included my worst and best 5 episodes of Season 3, and in this video, I wish to rectify that. But before getting into the reviews, there's a bit of background information I want to share with you all first. Technically speaking, despite being the 3rd season, this is the season that actually had the 2nd episode of the entire show that I've actually seen. The first episode I've seen actually being in Season 4, meaning I was already accustomed to Twilight being an Alicorn princess. And as a result, I've never actually been involved in the fandom to really experience the bedlam that take place when Alicorn Princess Twilight actually came into existence. So my perspective on Season 3 may be more positive than others that may have been with the show from the very beginning. Ultimately, if you know me, I tend to harp on very specific details, but all the same, I try to be fair and look at things both positively and negatively. If there are any disagreements you have with my ratings, you should feel more than free to voice them in the comments down below, but remember that I am only human and I am just doing this for fun. I also imagine that this is not the first video of mine that you're seeing, so if you're new to the series, I'd recommend that you check out Season 1 Revisited. It should tell you all you need to know about how I rate these episodes. With this all said and out behind us, let us get into the actual reviews. Episodes 53 and 54. The Crystal Empire. Twilight and her friends are tasked with defending the Crystal Empire from King Sombra. So this is the two-parter that tells us where Princess Cadance is mainly stationed in the show. She's tasked with watching over the Crystal Empire, a kingdom that's been lost for about a millennium, and by extension, a kingdom that Celestia knows very little about. The full extent being that King Sombra took over it, and basically Celestia and Luna managed to thwart him. It's an okay setup, but I have to wonder what's the point of obscuring the fact that King Sombra returned by referring to him as it. It feels unnecessarily vague considering that both Chrysalis and Discord have existed as villains before in the show. And clearly King Sombra isn't this unspeakable horror either, considering they say his name later in the episode. Ultimately, it's not that big of a deal, it just bugs me in particular. Otherwise, I think the first half of this episode fares fairly well. I do think it's tragic that we don't get to really hear too much about King Sombra and his past. He's just kind of this big, bad, maleficent force of nature in this episode so far. And all we really get to know about him is that he's a tyrant. And it's fine to have a purely bad villain, but it just makes him feel a little cliche. As a result, he has less of a motivation than either Nightmare Moon or Chrysalis, and he's less generally entertaining than Discord. Not a strike against this episode, and I'm aware that the comics do a lot to make him more interesting as a villain as well, but if I have to rely on supplemental material in order to get the maximum value out of this show, that's not really a good thing. Nonetheless, I do know for a fact still that King Sombra isn't the worst villain that this show will ever have. I think we can all agree that the Pony of Shadows has this guy thoroughly beat in that department. And to be fair to this episode, a lot of it is about suppressing King Sombra from actually being able to do anything. So there is more of an excuse as to why we know so little about him. Instead, the episode focuses a lot more on fleshing out the history of the Crystal Empire and the ponies that reside within it. And for what it is, I did really enjoy what the first half brought to the table. Most, if not all of the scenes involving Twilight and her friends I thought were genuinely really charming. And there is a lot of good humor to hold you over, like Rainbow Dash and Applejack teasing Rarity over her fascination with the Crystal Empire in general. I do have some qualms, however, over Shining Armor and Cadance's role in this episode. It's mentioned in the story that Cadance has been awake for days and barely has been able to eat because she had to keep her spell active to protect the Crystal Empire. But Shining Armor laments that he can't help because his magic is countered by King Sombra. But we only see damage done to his horn after the main 6 arrive. As far as before, I don't really know why Shining Armor doesn't create a barrier ahead of time. It's possible that King Sombra specifically counters the barrier spell, but can't for Cadance specifically, which if that's the case, okay, that's fine. But I would have appreciated a more concrete example than just telling us that. And I'm still left wondering why the heck Twilight doesn't try making a barrier considering her magic ability. When the second half meanwhile starts up, I'd overall say there's more good moments in this episode, but in general I find it less enjoyable than the first half. I really did not enjoy very much watching the main 5 try to distract the Crystal Ponies. Rainbow Dash in particular was an absolute gem. I really loved watching her in this episode, namely both parts 1 and 2. But in the second half, I did not really enjoy much of what we saw from Pinkie Pie at all. She wasn't obnoxious or anything, she just wasn't very funny. Fluttershy, meanwhile, I regret to say that the most entertained I was by seeing her in this episode was when she got knocked the heck out when jousting with Rainbow Dash. Meanwhile, Rarity and Applejack were both okay, but their scenes just felt like they went on for way too long. And I understand why these scenes even existed to begin with, yeah. Celestia tells Twilight that only she can really retrieve the Crystal Heart to save the Crystal Empire, and the rest of the main 6 still have to do at least something to fill in the runtime. But I feel like the bit of dialogue was actively counterproductive to the story that was being told. To be honest, I don't really know how Celestia's warning here wouldn't mean that you can't have the rest of the main 6 help Twilight out, but just have Twilight herself be the one to deliver the Crystal Heart to Cadence. It leaves the moral about self-sacrifice being important feeling phoned in. The execution isn't as bad as it could have been, but I do think it could still be better. I will say, however, I do really like seeing how Spike is getting the respect he deserves by being the one to actually save the Crystal Empire. Him being here to avenge Twilight, as well as just his dialogue in general when they're trying to find the Crystal Empire, does a lot of good to justify him being in this episode. I also just really like the scenes where Twilight and Spike are faced with their worst fears. It adds a lot of dimension to them as characters, especially with Spike, as we see that his worst fear is no longer being needed by Twilight and being sent away, which really screams to the bond that he and Twilight really do share. And if you asked me, it made the moment where Spike actually ended up avenging Twilight be a lot stronger too, because it well demonstrates the value that Spike holds in Twilight's darkest hour given the circumstances in the episode. And Twilight's worst fear being put on display also goes to show just how important it really was for Twilight to pass her test, and yet she was still willing to risk it by having Spike be the one to actually complete it. This couple of scenes is very good, and it actually helps to further the story. Also, I have to appreciate that this is the first episode of my recollection where there's a canonical death in it. King Sombra up and freaking dies at the end of the episode, and it is absolutely magnificent. All in all, I'd say that both halves are, at best, pretty good. Some dull moments in the second half do pull this episode down for me, but I overall do still think that the Crystal Empire is a good episode. Not great, mind you, but I do appreciate what this episode tried to do, and I do think it did a decent job for what it was. Also, near the end of the episode, we see that Luna is actually holding a book. A book with a certain cutie mark, which we also see reappear in Magical Mystery Cure. That is very interesting, and I actually really appreciate that level of foreshadowing too. But that won't be for a while. Episode 55. Too many Pinkie Pies. Pinkie Pie's desire to not miss out on fun with her friends leads to an outbreak of clones. This has to be one of the most horrifying concepts I've seen this show tackle so far. The story is that Pinkie Pie wants to spend time with her friends, but she doesn't want to miss out on any moments with them, and she gets this idea to clone herself so that she can be in multiple places at once. If you remember, as of this point in time, I've actually reviewed as much as Season 7, there was actually an episode in Season 6 called Every Little Thing She Does, which actually did tease the idea of Starlight being in multiple places at once, but it was ultimately a red herring. At the time, I was a bit disappointed that was not the direction that was went towards, but now admittedly, I appreciate the fact that it didn't go that direction, because knowing this episode exists, it would probably end up being a ripoff. In any case, I really like how the story goes about itself. Something I really appreciate is the fact that there are really no easy ways to tell the Pinkie Pies apart from each other, so the real one just ends up blending in with all the clones. So much so that not even we the audience can really tell who the real Pinkie Pie is. I like this because it really depends on how well we know the real Pinkie Pie to be able to tell her apart from the others. And all we really have to go off of is Pinkie Pie's memories. As such, it really feels like this is Pinkie Pie at her most fleshed out, and it makes her as a character a lot more compelling. Not only that, but if there was actually an easy way, or even really any way at all to physically tell the Pinkie Pies apart, it would make Twilight and the other ponies just look really dumb for not being able to recognize it too. And when it comes to this concept of not being able to tell who the real is from the fakes, having good reason to mistrust even the real one is important. Now there probably are nitpicks to be had with Pinkie Pie's motivation. After all, hearing about the fun you had from another Pinkie Pie doesn't really ring like you'd have the very same experience. But A, this episode never really delves into that logic, and B, it's been well established both in this episode and Party of One that Pinkie Pie prioritizes the happiness of others much above her own. So in a sense, Pinkie Pie's idea still makes perfect sense. I also just appreciate how there really is no outside pressure that's really forcing Pinkie Pie to try doing this either. For example, both Applejack and Rainbow Dash are perfectly okay with Pinkie Pie choosing one over the other. And it just allows Pinkie Pie's natural humor to really shine through, like her trying to be 20 minutes faster so that she can meet up with both Rainbow Dash and Applejack at the same time. And it's in the service of teaching a moral in that there are times where you won't be able to fit in with your friend's schedule. But that's okay, there are always going to be future occasions where you'll be able to meet with them all the same. I actually think this would have been a great lesson for Pinkie Pie to have learned in Griffin the Brush Off. You know, assuming it went the route of not making Gilda a bad person. Now, while it should be no surprise I'm calling this a good episode, there is one legitimate problem I do have with the story. And that's that Twilight gets the idea of testing the Pinkie Pies from Pinkie Pie. If we're being realistic, that would actually give the Pinkie Pie that gave the idea an advantage. And given the event that Twilight chose, watching paint dry, it doesn't even really make any sense. Because in her own words, the real Pinkie Pie would not be able to sit still for an elongated period of time. It's honestly a wonder how the real Pinkie Pie was not considered defective. I do, however, really like the idea of the real Pinkie Pie questioning if she even is the real Pinkie Pie anymore. But even that could have been addressed if the test that Twilight gave out was better suited to what Pinkie Pie actually knew. You gotta remember that the main six are a really tightly knitted clique. Pinkie Pie may have told the clones her friends' names, but that's really all we really know she taught them. Quizzing the Pinkie Pies on how well they actually know the real Pinkie Pie, or her friends for that matter, would likely have been a much more safe and effective method of singling out the real Pinkie Pie from the clones. It would also just fit Pinkie Pie a lot better as a character, considering her knowledge on literally every pony in Ponyville. Look no further than A Friend Indeed for examples of that. Nonetheless, I can appreciate the humor that was brought to the table from watching paint dry. It's just probably not the angle I would have preferred. Episode 56. One Bad Apple. Apple Bloom's cousin comes to visit and turns out to be a total bully. This episode hurt to watch. I feel like it had a lot going for it, but near the end it just completely fell off a cliff. But unlike Babs, there really was nothing to actually save her from tumbling down. Honestly, before we heard anything about why Babs was being a bully in Ponyville, like when we were told about the teasing she was suffering back at home in Manhattan, this episode was still pretty bad, but it was at least still salvageable. There were a lot of things earlier in this episode I didn't like, but I think the biggest one is that Sweetie Belle, despite her own morals, joined in her friends and not telling any adults about Babs being a bully to them. I actually think there was a lot of potential to have Sweetie Belle try telling Applejack, and Applejack just not believing her, with the excuse being that Babs knows how it feels like to be bullied and she would not do it to anyone else. I think it'd be reasonable, knowing that Applejack already knows that Babs is a bully victim, and given her pride in her own family, she believes that Babs would be better than that. Had the episode done that, I think the story would have flowed a lot better. Because as is, the fact that no one tries to tell Applejack about Babs being the way she is feels like a massive missed opportunity. And we already have foreshadowing that Applejack knows more than she's letting on. Before the theme song, we already have evidence that shows that Applejack was hesitant to tell Apple Bloom anything about why she was coming to Ponyville. And the way that Babs actively tries to hide her flank with her tail when she's actually shown that her cousin and her friends have no cutie marks, it paints a clear picture that she's self-conscious about it. And another thing, I do think that Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon are too quick to accept Babs into their clique, and I actually would have really appreciated if they were only being nice to Babs as a means of spiting the CMC, but in reality they just did not actually care about her as a person at all. I feel that could have really added to Diamond Tiara's character, knowing that she's a person that's just really good at getting people to do what she wants them to do. Past all of that, this episode isn't awful. For starters, I think the song Babs Seed is actually really good. Not only is it catchy, but I think it very well communicates just how trying to avoid a bully doesn't really work, and it serves as a good justification for the CMC getting back at Babs for how she was treating them all. And I'll admit, had the CMC got their revenge, Babs ended up getting hurt, they felt bad about it, and only then the truth came out, I'd probably call this episode okay, because then I think the episode would have done a decent job at establishing that two wrongs don't make a right, provided it's made abundantly clear that it was Babs' fault for even trying the CMC in the first place. Unfortunately, this episode goes into a very different and, dare I say, asinine direction. You see, after the CMC see Babs off in their float, Applejack comes out of nowhere and basically just drops this information that the reason that Babs came to Ponyville is to get away from bullies back at home, which this episode attempts to use to justify Babs being a bully in this episode. Where do I even start with this and why this is so wrong? First of all, this information, as far as we're really concerned, comes clear out of nowhere. Applejack tries to handwave this as far as why she didn't say anything earlier by saying she didn't want Babs to feel singled out, but that doesn't really address why she feels the need to say that at all. With all due respect, there are only two ways I could really see this admission coming from Applejack. Either it's a betrayal of trust, considering the fact that Babs would tell this to Applejack in confidence in hopes of keeping it confidential, or there was just absolutely no reason not to say anything earlier. And Applejack not telling this to Applebloom in private makes absolutely no sense. Shortly following this, by the way, the CMC come to the conclusion that in trying to retaliate against Babs, they become bullies too, and to that, all I can really say is, no. Last I checked, you didn't force Babs to jump into that float. She quite literally forced herself into it. And secondly, you're not a bully for defending yourself. That's ridiculous. There are unfortunately times where the only way to get someone to leave you alone is to show them that you're not to be trifled with. Now, it is an unfortunate reality that in trying to retaliate, you can be seen as the bad guy in this situation. So I see what the intent in this episode is. It's like that one episode of Static Shock where you see that this kid was getting bullied, and he brought a gun to school to permanently end his problem. And some parallels can be drawn between that episode and this episode of Friendship is Magic, in that the actions of both victims of bullying had their actions be premeditated. Had this episode's message been better worded, I don't think the moral would have been nearly as controversial. But to suggest that retaliating against a bully at all makes you a bully yourself? No, that's baloney. Especially when the moral of this episode, in that telling an adult will get your bullying problem solved, is not the catch-all solution this episode thinks it is. It's a good first step, but it doesn't always end after that. In fact, it's entirely possible that bullying can possibly even get worse after the fact. For Applebloom specifically, yes, the moral does make sense in that she would be able to get the bullying problem solved if she went to Applejack right away. Even knowing the amount of influence that Diamond Tiara has, being the daughter of Filthy Rich, the best customer that the Apples have, Family Appreciation Day makes it abundantly clear that the Riches and the Apples are actually on really good terms with each other. So it's improbable that Applebloom's living situation would be compromised in any meaningful way. Secondly, even if Applejack didn't believe the CMC in regards to Babs being a bully, there's definitely an argument that could be made that Rarity or even Twilight is conscious to the fact that the CMC are bullied by Diamond Tiara, since both Twilight and Applejack were there for Diamond Tiara's quinceañera. So at least for this episode, I don't think the moral is all of that bad. Maybe naive and a little too overly optimistic, but it is a step in the right direction. However, the fact that the episode itself doesn't really follow up on its own moral, yeah, let's talk about that. Near the end of this episode, we actually see both Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon attempt to rile up the CMC again, and they do it right in front of Applejack, who proceeds to do absolutely nothing but just stare angrily at them. Instead, the episode has Babs shoot him out for being punks, which, if this is supposed to redeem Babs in the eyes of the audience, the problem is that in doing that, the episode undermined its own moral by not having Applejack actually do anything like she said she would. And all of a sudden, this moral becomes lip service. If you want to communicate that telling an adult would be able to solve a bullying problem, have the adult actually solve the freaking problem. I want to see Applejack tell Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon off, get angry at them, smash her hoof on the ground so hard that it breaks the wood below her, with her being as angry as she is still holding her temper back, and warning these two little snots that she'll tell their parents on them if they keep this crap up. Really sell us on knowing just how much Applejack cares about her sister and her friends. What we got as is, nah, this is not it. All in all, should be no surprise, but I'm calling this a nightmare episode. The writing here is just really clumsy all around. And beyond the song, there really isn't much else to really save its story. I still have to wonder how Babs had Applebloom sleeping on the freaking floor. Like, does Applejack just not check up on Babs in the middle of the night? How does she not see this all? Overall, I'm not happy with this episode. Episode 57, Magic Duel. Trixie returns to enact her vengeance on Twilight and her friends. Now here's an episode I consider an absolute gem, which is surprising because Magic Duel pulls a lot from episodes I've already gotten on record saying I'm not a big fan of. It features both Trixie and Sakura, both characters who in their debut episodes were not really given a very good start to the show. There's also a fair few references to the episode's form of the century with the Paris sprites. Another episode I consider to be pretty poor all around. But despite all of that, I find this episode to be very enjoyable. The grudge match between Trixie and Twilight has a lot of really fun animation, which makes it an utter delight to continue watching this episode to see what actually gets thrown on the screen next. And focusing on Trixie for a bit, I actually really love how this episode handled her character. Because even back in Ghostbusters, Trixie was never actually a malicious character at all. Even when messing with Applejack, Rarity, and Rainbow Dash, A, she was only playing to the crowd, and B, those three struck first. So Trixie did have the right to respond. So knowing how she's only acting the way she does in Magic Duel due to corruption from the Alicorn Amulet, it gives a lot of leeway for her to go above and beyond, and I love just how far she goes with it. I think early in the episode, my favorite thing that she does is take away Pinkie Pie's mouth, and you actually see that she can't eat anything because her mouth is just gone. And I love how morbid the episode treats it, because it heavily implies she's gonna die of starvation without her mouth. That's really good. We also later in the episode just see how rowdy Trixie's become with the amulet on her neck. I really enjoy seeing her bully Snips and Snails, not just because those characters are really annoying, but it is also just entirely their fault for getting Trixie to become an outcast. I especially love seeing Trixie force Snips and Snails to drag her around with a carriage that doesn't have wheels on it. It sounds horrible because she's effectively forcing these kids to do labor, but screw it, this was actually really funny. The way Trixie gets stopped in this episode is also just really clever, and one of the few times I was actually satisfied seeing a villain get defeated in the show. See, the reality is that with the Alicorn Amulet, Trixie was genuinely stronger than Twilight could ever hope to be, so Twilight couldn't actually match Trixie's strength. Instead, she took a cue from Sakura and learned how to bluff Trixie off of her hand, making Trixie think that Twilight's hand was stronger than it actually was. And then getting Trixie to fold, she discarded what she had, which was actually strong, to take for herself what was in actuality just a complete brick. It is brilliant, and one of the few times in the show that how a villain was defeated felt like it made perfect sense. Though to be fair, a lot of things in this episode made a lot of sense. For example, Twilight is able to actually think logically and not take a bet that makes absolutely no sense for her to take, only accepting it when she recognizes that Trixie will otherwise keep terrorizing Ponyville if she doesn't. In all honesty, it's a pretty minor thing to point out, but it's a noticeable improvement after the Super Speedy Cider Squeezy 6000, where you see Granny Smith take a wager that doesn't benefit the apples at all to actually accept. I gotta give credit where it's due, even if only because both episodes had the same writer behind them, M.A. Larson. There's lots of other little things I could compliment too. I, for example, really love seeing Sakura in this episode. I like the moment where she's training Twilight, and she effectively tells Twilight no Johns when she's talking about Trixie and how she seemed different. The line she speaks is, "Your thinking needs to readjust. Total concentration is a must." But all around, it's a very enjoyable episode. There are a few things I can nitpick about it, but it's a good episode nonetheless. As for those nitpicks, they don't really impact my enjoyment of this episode. There's probably one problem I actually have with it, but otherwise, nothing else really is that bad. For starters, when you see Twilight use her illusions to throw Trixie off of her game, the ponies meant to switch places with Applejack and Rarity actually have the same eye color as them both, which that in and of itself isn't actually the problem. The problem is that when it came to Granny Smith taking the position of Applejack, she actually does have a different eye color. But I can't think of an explanation that could rationalize this. Maybe they all had contacts or something. And missing only one pony in regards to that, I can imagine that Trixie would have a very hard time noticing that. Another thing is the shopkeeper at the very beginning of this episode. He has the Alicorn Amulet just on display, but he tells Trixie that it's too dangerous to sell or something. Now, I may not be privy to this type of dialogue, but if it's too dangerous to sell, then why have it on display? I want to be nice and say that him saying that is to instead say that it's just like really expensive, but it's all the same really distracting dialogue for me. The only other thing I feel is worth bringing up is probably Fluttershy and how she was written in this episode. I get that she's not perfect, and as a result, she's not going to be able to immediately master a lesson after learning from it once. But how cowardly she acts in this episode feels out of character for her. She's not the kind of pony to shy away from doing her duty if she knows that she's the only pony that can do it. And she's been in the Everfree Forest before, and once even stared death in the face if the cockatrice is anything to go by and Stairmaster. I'm not against her showing her anxiety, as by design, she's a very skittish character. But this episode does feel like it exaggerates that aspect of her. Those issues aside, I don't really have any problems with Magic Duel. It's definitely the best episode of Season 3 so far. Though I have to say, the fact that after this episode Trixie is now officially a terrorist, and if that's the wrong word, at the very minimum she's a bit of a dictator, Yeah. Good luck beating those allegations. You may be forgiven, but I can totally understand not being able to trust you after this. Episode 58, Sleepless in Ponyville. Scootaloo tries to impress Rainbow Dash when their friends go camping. I feel like given the subject of this episode, there really isn't much to critique. Scootaloo's kind of a blank slate at this point in the show. We can make inferences on her personality after episodes like the mysterious mirror duel, which show that she holds Rainbow Dash in extremely high regard. But we know very little about her family. It's not like with Apple Bloom, who has Applejack as her big sister, or Sweetie Belle with Rarity. And with those two pairs in particular, it's not hard to see how they differ either. For example, Rarity is more reserved, while Sweetie Belle is more, well, outwardly outgoing. Meanwhile, Applejack and Apple Bloom are more similar, but Applejack is more content where she is now, while Apple Bloom is more of a go-getter, more focused on innovation and moving forward. Scootaloo, meanwhile, doesn't really have any other family members to really compare her to, so all we can really go off of is how much she aspires to be like Rainbow Dash. Now, that's not a bad thing, and this episode does do a good job at showing exactly how Scootaloo is actively trying to fight against who she actually is, by trying to be someone who she's not. And it all adds up to what's, in my opinion, a really cute story. This episode has no shortage of moments which really capitalize on Scootaloo's fears, which is entirely realistic considering the fact that, well, she's a freaking child. A child which, keep in mind, she doesn't have any family she feels can protect her at this point in time. So it goes without saying, but her sleepless nights end up making perfect sense within the context of the episode. I also just really love the slapstick done with Scootaloo in this story. My favorite part has to be when she's sleep scootering on her scooter and she just ends up having all of these wacky things happen to her. What with the crocodile and the bear and the fish. This is a type of old-timey gag I think was done much better in this episode than it was in putting her hoof down. It feels a lot more appropriate and fitting given the context of the story, and it likewise is actually funny to watch. That's not to say the other characters were any lesser by comparison though. Granted, I don't really recall much of Apple Bloom in this episode. I know she exists within it, but I don't think she was really all too noteworthy. But I thought Sweetie Belle had a good few moments in this story. Something that drew my attention actually was just how strong she was, knowing that she's able to pull that whole cart with all of Rarity's luggage and push Rarity herself. You know, given her size and the race of pony she is, she's deceptively strong. She also had that absolutely stellar moment of singing campfire songs near the end of the episode. I really love that. Applejack and Rarity were also pretty fun too. I like the quips that Applejack would throw out at Rarity's expense and then Rarity just not caring what Applejack was saying in the slightest. Actually, on the note of Rarity, I think it's really funny how heavily she was packing for the camping trip, and yet she had like a regular old 10 for the Super Speedy Cider Squeezy 6000. Not a complaint, just a really funny observation that she was in a regular old 10 like anyone else when she has this mansion of a 10 in this episode. Inversely, I also just really appreciate how attentive Applejack was to the feelings of Scootaloo. It's subtle, but it does a good job communicating how good of a big sister she is to Apple Bloom. And then there's Rainbow Dash, who admittedly was just a delight to see earlier in the story. I enjoyed seeing the stunts that she'd pull off, like gathering all of the stumps for everyone to sit on while they were on their camping trip. We already know how adept Rainbow Dash is as a flyer, but it's just cool to see more of this justification and really show what Scootaloo sees in her. Though this is probably just me, but I think it's a bit of a missed opportunity to see that Rainbow Dash is telling both campfire stories in this episode. What do I mean by that? Well, there's nothing that says that Rainbow Dash wouldn't know both campfire stories, the one about the rusty horseshoe or the one with the headless horse. But I think it'd be interesting if we actually heard that story about the headless horse from Applejack or Rarity. More likely Applejack though, because this seemed like more of her style. Because the headless horse story is something we actually heard from season 1. Granted, it was Twilight that was telling it, but she was telling it to Rarity and Applejack. Rainbow Dash wasn't in that episode. I just think it would have been a really cool callback if it was Applejack specifically to tell it, because that would be the explanation for where the story came from. And then there's also Princess Luna, the last character of focus in this episode. This episode actually gives us insight on her role in the show and the characters in general. She visits the dreams of ponies that are asleep at night, and basically helps them through their problems. Now I have a couple of thoughts on this, the first one actually being that the fact that it's a nightmare that Scootaloo is experiencing, and also knowing the villainous name of Nightmare Moon that Luna had before she was reformed, I think it's a really cool callback to Friendship is Magic Part 2 when you see Pinkie Pie's Trial of Laughter with all of the trees in the similar shape and style. That's pretty neat. The second thought is just the fact that being able to travel into the subconscious of other ponies in their sleep sounds like it'd be ripe for abuse. As a concept, that's just terrifying. But to be fair, it also explains how Rainbow Dash was able to wake up and recognize that Scootaloo was missing and how she knew to rescue her. Ultimately, I think this episode covered its bases really well. Nothing really sticks out as wrong in this story for me. There are things I think could have been better about it, but it wouldn't be fair to deny calling this episode good off of that alone, because I think the story as is still works very well. The only remaining question is whether I'd call this a sweet dream or a beautiful nightmare. But given the circumstances behind its rating, let's say it's a product of the morning sun. Episode 59, Wonderbolts Academy. Rainbow Dash begins her Wonderbolt training, playing second fiddle to a more bold trainee. I wonder if I'd piss anyone off if I said I found this episode to be really mid. There's a fair few good moments in this episode for sure. I thought the beginning with Pinkie Pie was at least decently entertaining, for example. And the bit near the ending where you see Rainbow Dash give up on her dream of becoming a Wonderbolt if being a Wonderbolt means endangering the lives of other ponies was actually pretty awesome of her. You know, there are some definite good moments in it. However, it's unfortunately balanced out by a lot of mediocre moments, and regarding Pinkie Pie, just some genuinely bad moments. Let's start with the bad. I did not like Pinkie Pie in this episode much of at all. A case could be made that she's in character. After all, there are several episodes you could look to suggest that she is just extremely clingy, but this episode in particular has her just be especially neurotic, almost as bad as Twilight could get on occasion. Really, it all boils down to just I don't find Pinkie Pie funny in this episode. It oftentimes feels like it just gets in the way of the actual training that Rainbow Dash and Lightning Dust are going through. And considering how this episode ends, I do think I could have much better allocated its resources to making a more developed ending for the story, considering what happens to Lightning Dust is not very well understood in the episode itself. Also, an argument could be made that Pinkie Pie's characterization should be past this point. She's shown repeatedly obsessing over whether or not Rainbow Dash even remembers her name or her friends anymore, which even for Pinkie Pie feels just downright excessive. And it really doesn't help either that this is after Party of One, where Pinkie Pie learned to expect the best of her friends and not assume the worst. So in a way, Pinkie Pie feels actively regressed in this episode. It's kinda sad how the most entertainment I've gotten out of Pinkie Pie is just seeing Applejack react to her by looking at the camera and thinking, "You seeing this? This is what I have to deal with." Obviously she doesn't actually say it, but I can totally tell that's what she's thinking from her facial expression. So yeah, overall, I think Pinkie Pie was a total bust in this episode. Regarding the actual conflict, I thought the pseudo-camaraderie/rivalry between Rainbow Dash and Lightning Dust was pretty fun to watch. It makes an interesting case as far as the importance of pushing yourself in the right direction as opposed to pushing yourself too hard and putting others in danger. And as a foil, I do think that Lightning Dust is a good character. I like how this episode establishes that Lightning Dust is a pony that doesn't really pay very much attention to the safety of other ponies. It contrasts really well to Rainbow Dash, who we've seen repeatedly in this show only ever really practice in areas where she wouldn't be putting others at risk. And if others do get hurt or are impacted in any way, it's still abundantly clear that she's not trying to put anyone else in danger. Episodes like Sonic Rain Boom, Applebuck Season, and Read and Weep come to mind for that. However, the ideology that Lightning Dust works under is also actively supported by Spitfire, and that leads into some more problems with the storytelling. Now, it is reasonable to say that Lightning Dust can be a leader because she pushes herself harder than others do. However, therein lies the issue. This is behavior that's actively being rewarded. Now, to give Spitfire the benefit of the doubt, she may not very well know the extent of what Lightning Dust has actually been doing in the story, which would be valid for the flag hunt and the cloud busting, because both of those accounts happened out of her line of sight. But it's a slightly harder sell for the precision flying area. And if she did see Lightning Dust and Rainbow Dash playing rough there, well, if you ask me, it wouldn't really be fair then to punish Lightning Dust at the end of the episode by being reckless for engaging in that very same behavior that you've actively been condoning and even supporting. Still, I feel like this is a pretty weak argument because it happens so far away from the actual training grounds that I could not imagine that Spitfire would get a good visual of what actually happened there. And if I was Spitfire, I would definitely expect trainees to know better than to recklessly endanger other ponies. It's also just really poor taste to show up people that are actively struggling in an area where you're proficient in. For that matter, I have to give Rainbow Dash credit for at least trying to reason with Lightning Dust, because it reflects very well on Rainbow Dash's characterization to look out for those who are less talented than you are. There are plenty of episodes before and after this one that reflect that very same personality trait of hers. From the Cutie Mark Chronicles to the Lost Treasure of Griffinstone. I still really wish we got to see what actually happened to Lightning Dust at the end of the episode. We see she gets her badge taken from her, but that's really it. At least before she's escorted off the premises. And if all that happened was that she got kicked out, I hate to say it, but I think she got off just really easy then, considering what nearly happened was that she committed involuntary manslaughter. All this being said, I think this is just an okay episode. Far from the worst, but also far from the best. Just be thankful you're not in a full-body wing and hoof cast drinking through a straw. Episode 60, Apple Family Reunion. Applejack oversees a family reunion which sees her entire family attend, intending for a truly memorable time. Well, I'll say one thing, this episode succeeded in getting me to remember a lot of memories as I was watching it. Several episodes came to mind as I was watching this episode and seeing how Applejack was acting within it. The first of which was actually a Season 5 episode in Hearthbreakers. Because that episode actually echoed a problem that Applejack had in this episode, where she was actually very much concerned with the results of the celebration, more so than the time being spent celebrating with others. And not gonna lie, knowing that actually makes Hearthbreakers a little bit worse in my opinion, because now someone can argue that this is something that Applejack should have already moved past. However, in that episode, I would still argue that Applejack was still clearly family-oriented. She still placed great emphasis on the happiness of others, as opposed to, for lack of a better word, doing things by the book. So I still see at least she was in character in that episode. However, the other episode I was reminded of was Every Little Thing She Does. And that episode had a much better excuse for why Starlight was acting the way that she was. And that Starlight was still learning. It at least makes sense that Starlight had room to grow to actually learn this lesson. Applejack? It makes absolutely no sense why she has to learn this lesson at all. I understand that Applejack can be fixated on doing work, but that's because she's just a naturally hard worker. She's not even close to being as neurotic as this episode makes her out to be. This is communicated very well in episodes like Sisterhood of Social, for example, where though Applejack was busy doing chores, it didn't detract from her having fun with Apple Bloom, and she's demonstrated creativity in making an otherwise mundane task actually enjoyable for the both of them. Even in episodes where she's engaged in serious business like a Canterlot wedding and the Crystal Empire, she's shown to enjoy having some downtime with her friends. And in the most simplest terms, is not nearly the fuddy-duddy that Apple Family Reunion tries to make her out to be. This also leaks into the scenes actually involving the Apple Family Reunion, and I just have to say it, this was very uncomfortable to watch. I genuinely do not know what the writer was going for here, but it's not good. What does it say? When I'm actively enjoying hearing the banter and the recollection between all the apples as to recounting their experiences and whatever happened between them before, as opposed to the riveting activities like seeing Babs and Apple Bloom work themselves to exhaustion with this obstacle course, or seeing these elderly mayors be forced to stand as they're quilting, or seeing some mothers who are talking about their kids be told to, quote-unquote, keep the assembly line moving. Let me tell you, when I saw their smiles just fade into nothingness, making these apple fritters and just not really enjoying themselves at all, I felt my heart sink. I hate this. Because you know this implies they have enough going on back at home. They don't want to keep working somewhere else when they should just be enjoying themselves. And it as a result makes me really not like Applejack in this episode. It left me wondering why Applejack couldn't just hire anyone else to help with the apple fritters instead. Because the Apple Family Reunion cannot be exclusive to apples. We see Hasty Turnip Truck in this episode. He was the stallion from Sweet and Elite. He could be a distant cousin, but all the same, he's not an apple. Why not look to any of Applejack's friends for help? Not only am I certain that they would not mind, but they were there before the reunion even started, helping with setting it up. They were also referred to as honorary family members in the Super Speedy Cider Squeezy 6000. And heck, even before knowing Twilight, Applejack and her family treated Twilight like family, and Apple Bloom was even there to encourage Twilight to stick around for a while to enjoy the company. It sounds like a strange idea at first, but I think it actually makes a lot of sense. Especially since it's Applejack that's actually coordinating the reunion this time around. She would have the final say in who could actually attend. Not only that, but like in other episodes, I'd expect them to actually put up some freaking resistance. As I was revisiting this episode, I had to wonder why Granny Smith never thought to try telling Applejack that what she's doing isn't actually what she should be doing. Not only is Granny Smith typically quick to shoot her mouth off if she feels it's necessary, but Applejack also has a lot of respect for what she has to say. It really feels like the only reason Granny Smith doesn't say anything is because it'd be able to solve the problem of the episode way more quickly than if she didn't. And that's not even getting into the fact That Applejack having her Granny Smith and her aunts using a sewing machine, that is definitely out of character for Applejack. She is a pony that is very much focused on tradition, often to a fault. Getting rid of rocking chairs to make way for an electric sewing machine is not something she would ever do. Yeah, not only are the activities just not enjoyable to watch, but Applejack's characterization had to be broken to be able to fit it all in. So this episode offers the worst of both worlds. For that matter, I'm not convinced that Applejack having her entire family be able to show up for the Apple Family reunion should be justification enough for her character to go this far off the deep end. And for that matter, I don't think Applejack's characterization really reflects that anyway. It'd be one thing if she was just bubbling with anxiety or something, like if she was met with actual resistance when everyone else was trying to do their own thing but Applejack wanted them to do everything her own way. But her family is really quick to acquiesce when she asks them to do anything for her. So there isn't even really a conflict in this episode, not until the end where the barn gets destroyed, but nothing really results from that beyond Applejack learning a lesson that she already should have freaking known. So this episode can't even sell me that Applejack is feeling this emotion that she's supposed to be feeling to justify how she's acting. And you know something else? I can imagine this exact story premise working exceptionally well for any other member of the main six. First of all, how Applejack is acting, had you put Twilight in this episode and had all the other characters fashioned around Twilight's bloodline, I could see this making perfect sense for her. Same with Rarity, though with her it'd probably be a harder sell, because we've already seen her parents. And accepting how her friends and family are different from Rarity and how she wishes to present herself, that type of story was already explored in Sweet and Elite. Pinkie Pie? Her family lives on a rock farm. And to us, they're as dull as can be. We already saw how her immediate family reacted to a party. Imagine if her greater family beyond that immediate family reacted to one. You could write a conflict about a difference in ideals off of that alone. And regarding Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash, we've received absolutely no information regarding their upbringings whatsoever. The canvas is quite literally as white as a ghost. For Applejack, the only thing I could possibly see that works in her favor in this episode is still entirely reliant on outside information. Longtime fans of the show may be aware of the fact that Applejack's parents are actually deceased. That's what the pair of shooting stars we see near the beginning and at the end of the episode were meant to symbolize. But at best, that's only mildly hinted at. It's not until season 5 where we get any kind of confirmation that they're actually gone. So I don't really count it. And that's a shame, because if there was more time dedicated to actually talking about Applejack's parents, it could have done this episode a lot of favor. So yeah, the foundation is just not there, the story is awful, the characterization is absolutely putrid, and the moral while good is entirely redundant for the character who has to learn it. It's a nightmare episode. I've said a lot so far, but I still have more things to rant about in this episode. For example, there are shots where you see the moon is just hanging in the sky and it's supposed to be a crescent, but the moon looks really weird. You see all these craters on the moon and there's also this light shining on it, but it's really only prominent in one direction. And if you look closely enough, you can see that there's just a big purple freaking circle over it. As evidenced by the fact that the moon's glow just randomly cuts off when you get to that circle. And then it hit me. This episode took an image of the mirror in the moon, pasted it on the night sky, and just thought no one would freaking notice. Not only does it look bad, but it really speaks to the lack of overall polish in this episode. It's honestly embarrassing. Negativity aside, there are a few things in this episode I did like about it. I thought the few interactions between Babs and Apple Bloom were pretty cute, as well as just all the scenes of seeing the apples just talk amongst each other and having a good time. I just wish so that it wasn't cut so dreadfully short, but that's leading into the negatives. I thought the fruit bat scene was actually really cool. I like how Applejack was able to orchestrate this rainbow pattern with all the fruit bats being there, and it's actually just a really creative play on words with an animal that actually looks like a fruit that actually is a bat. It's cute, I like it. That aside, the only other thing about this episode I actually liked about it was during the Raise This Barn song. There's this scene that one of the mayors actually used her dress as a transition. We need more transitions like that, that's just funny. Almost as funny as Raise This Barn's misheard lyrics. Raise this barn, 1, 2, 3, 4. Episode 61, Spike at Your Service. Applejack saves Spike's life, and he in return swears his life to her. I feel very weird about talking about this episode. This was actually the second episode I've ever seen in the entire show. At the time, I didn't really think too much of it because I didn't really know Spike all too well as a character. But now? Well, let me just throw my sentiment out here. I don't think there's been another episode of the entire show up to now that gave less of a crap as far as the characters and how they're presented than this episode did. For starters, Spike's personality is entirely unrecognizable from earlier in the show or after this point in the show. He is unrecognizable just how bad he is in this episode. I'm saying he's so flat, he may as well be one-dimensional. He's gone from a precocious assistant with a slight boyish charm to a stereotypical boy in the eyes of a sexist woman. Just from the start of this episode, you can tell that a very low opinion is actively held about Spike as a character. His to-do list consists of cliché actions that a boy might find enjoyable, like touching his nose with his tongue or smelling his dirty feet, ignoring the fact that Spike is actually a very clean person. Yes, this is the same dragon that will eat muffins out of the trash, but he's also very particular about keeping himself clean. Dragon Quest, for example, shows how particular he is about not getting any kind of stains on his scales. And if Party of One is any sign, he takes his sweet time when taking baths too. What I'm driving at is that Spike is very much effeminate. And even if he wasn't, men do have standards for being clean too. It's not an exclusively feminine trait. The theme song did not even get to start yet, and how Spike is acting is already entirely out of character for him. Heck, if Spike has so much free time, why not think to check how Rarity is doing? Or maybe go to a place where children can have fun like a bowling alley, or maybe an arcade. I'm just saying, Ponyville has no shortage of fun attractions for children to engage in. Heck, later on while wandering around he finds a hot air balloon and wants to ride in that. Moving on from this though, we see Applejack save Spike's life from some Timberwolves, and this leads to Spike owing his life to Applejack as a part of his Dragon Code, which makes no sense for a variety of reasons. First of all, Spike has this dragon code because he wants to be seen as a noble dragon, but by what standards? With the exception of Spike, all dragons have been shown disfavorably. In the last episode, the featured dragon prominently was Dragon Quest, so he doesn't exactly have any role models to look up to. Secondly, when was this dragon code even established? Because if he had it his whole life, then where was it when he was rescued by Rainbow Dash or Fluttershy, or Cadence, or Twilight? I understand that continuity can be a pain to ride around, but I'm just saying, Applejack ain't the first to ever save his life in the show. Not to mention reason number 3. I would think that lifelong servitude is way too freaking extreme for a baby dragon to consider an appropriate payment, and the fact that Twilight actually agreed to this is mental to me. Especially when you know that Spike's biggest fear is not being needed by Twilight anymore. And yet, in spite of this, Spike treats telling Twilight that he won't be able to serve her anymore like he's breaking up with his girlfriend. He's so casual about it that it's comedic. And of course, Twilight is so preoccupied with what she's doing that she doesn't even notice. But what does that matter anyway? She agreed with Spike that this will be an appropriate course of action. The problems with Twilight started long before this episode, I can guarantee you that. Either way, Spike owes his life to Applejack, and he's gonna do chores for her. What does he do? He ends up making mess after mess in her house. It starts off innocently enough with him making some slight mistakes when trying to help Apple Bloom with cleaning the pigs, but it does not take long to get absolutely ridiculous later. For example, this dragon that was before very much gifted when it came to culinary arts, like with baking, commits several health code violations when cooking in Applejack's kitchen. Never mind the fact that he's making a big mess when stirring the pie mixture. He put his claw in the mixture and put it in his mouth. What? Okay, listen, Spike may be a baby dragon, I'm not gonna deny that. But even for a child, Spike is no stranger to feeling guilt or shame. There may be episodes where he's rude, like in Winter Wrap-Up or Hurricane Fluttershy, but those are words, not actions. When it comes to bad actions, he actually does have a sense of shame associated with him. Like when he accidentally burned Twilight's book in Owl's World at Enswell and tried to hide the fact that he did it. Or in Lesson 0 when he tried the grandstand and Twilight and her friends shamed him for it. Meanwhile, Spike doesn't react at all to making a massive mess in Applejack's kitchen. Which is again, something that conceivably Spike should never actually do. And this ends up muddying the moral at the end of the story too. I agree that you shouldn't try to force others to conform to your moral code. For obvious reasons, that would be extremely uncomfortable for the other party. Even Season 7's Not Asking for Trouble understood this and had Pinkie Pie just do her good deed and try to leave before the Axe could notice, because she and her friends were showing respect to Prince Rutherford and not wanting to ask for help. The problem is that Spike is doing a bad job at trying to help Applejack. So the moral ends up being less about making Applejack uncomfortable and more about just being a nuisance in her life. I have to wonder, what if this episode actually had Spike be competent, and what ends up happening instead is that Applejack has so much time to herself now that she doesn't know what to do anymore. I think there's a lot to explore in that idea, because Applejack is already where she wants to be in her life. She loves working at Sweet Apple Acres and doing her chores. To not have to do that anymore would be a really big shakeup for her. Like, I know why this episode is using Applejack as the character who Spike is serving, because originally Rarity was going to be that character, but the showrunners actually believed that Rarity would not be a likable character if they went with the original plan. Which, if that's the case, then so be it. I'll take your word for it, because if you believe that it would have been a really bad episode, then, well shoot, you would know better than I would. I'm just a casual viewer. But in only changing who Spike is serving, you run into an entirely different problem. And that's that there's really no excuse for Spike to act this way at all. In Rarity's presence, I get it. He's love-struck by her, and he would do anything for her. But his infatuation with Rarity would see him also inadvertently make a lot of mistakes because he's more focused on her than actually doing his tasks. You know, there's an outside force that's leading to a character doing something out of character for them because they're not all there mentally. It's a very logical way to get a character to do something they wouldn't usually do. Like Rarity participating with Sweetie Belle in the Sisterhood Social. She hates getting dirty, but she'll do it for her sister because it'll make her happy. Without that piece of the puzzle, Spike is just out of character, period. And there's really no getting around it. It's bad writing. I'm not even going to bring up the fact that Applejack and Granny Smith actually had Spike try to carry some eggs down when they're on a shelf that not even the ponies can reach. Seriously, that shelf is so high, you'd have to be either a Pegasus or a unicorn to get it down. But in the very same scene, a few seconds later, you see eggs that are already on the counter. It's a minor detail, but it's still a plot hole. I will admit though, I laughed really hard at seeing how Spike was actually handled in this scene. But it also makes me speculate as to what we just really lost with the fact that Rarity isn't a character that will be served. Because this is genuinely really funny stuff. Anyways, the plot migrates to Rarity's place and things only get worse from here. I will admit to finding it fairly charming to see Rarity actually bite the pie that Spike baked for her, but still, that pie looks absolutely atrocious, and Spike should have more pride in his own craft. Not even should, he does have more pride in himself and in his own craft. This is the same dragon who got offended from being told that he doesn't act like other dragons, and for that matter, got flustered when Rarity was infantilizing him. He's desperate, but he's not that desperate. And then the episode from here takes a very strange turn. Applejack is actually getting help from her friends to try and get rid of Spike, and both Rarity and Rainbow Dash have moments where they're actually just fantasizing over having a slave. Yeah, make the white pony fantasize about having a slave. That looks freaking fantastic. I don't get it. How do you have it so that Rarity is not the character in question that Spike would serve, yet you have moments like this which still paint her as being horrible? What kind of contradictory BS is this? Anyways, as the episode proceeds, it's figured that there's only really one way to get Spike to finally stop serving Applejack, and if you're familiar with this type of plot, you probably already know what it is. It's getting Spike to save Applejack's life. And funnily enough, it's only now we get to see Pinkie Pie in this episode, and she's just not funny at all. Really, she adds absolutely nothing to the story. They stage a Timberwolf attack, and Spike actually buys it for a second, but then he figures out that it's not a real Timberwolf. I'm sorry, but I cannot take this seriously. Just earlier in this scene, we saw Spike counting every individual blade of grass at Sweet Apple Acres. And before that, he built a tower of rock specifically for Rainbow Dash to smash into. And even before that, he somehow managed to destroy Rarity's plumbing trying to wash the freaking dishes. And only now he gains a brain cell? It might be just me, but I really would rather Spike just pick a lane and stick to it. Even though admittedly, the reactions gotten from this are, again, really funny. I love the scene where the fake Timberwolf was actually biting into Applejack's head. And as Spike caught on to the fact that he was actually being tricked, you actually see both Applejack and the prop that Twilight was puppeting just looking at Spike. I don't think Twilight had to commit that hard to the bit, but I'm really thankful she did. And lo and behold, oh look, it's a real Timberwolf attack. You have to run for your lives. And as this is going on, a rock falls on Applejack's back hoof and she's actually stuck. This is the same pony whose hind legs are able to stop a cart from careening off of a cliff in the mysterious Duel. The same pony who can buck trees so hard that she causes apples to fall down. And bear in mind, the same pony with bucking strength so hard that she can shatter targets just by bucking them with one hoof. Anyone who knows Applejack would know for a fact that one single pebble is not going to stop her. She's by far the most physically gifted member of the main six. This is an abominable downgrade to her character to make her so unnaturally weak for the plot to actually work. And the way she gets saved is somehow stupider. Spike's a dragon that can breathe fire. What does he do? He grabs a pebble off the ground, launches it into Timberwolf's mouth, and it chokes to death. And afterwards, only then, it stops coming back from the dead. I mean, again, it's comedic how it manages to die. But outside of being a guilty pleasure, it's not going to help this episode much at all. And the next scene made me wonder, where the heck were Applejack's friends as this was happening? And then I realized, they abandoned Applejack and Spike with the Timberwolf and just ran up to save themselves. Which, wow, that's sad. All of them abandoned Applejack in her moment of need, including and not being limited to Rainbow Dash, the element of loyalty, and the pony who will face danger head on if her friends are in trouble. Nope, sorry Applejack, you're on your own this time. There have been actual villains that are some of the most maligned characters in the series that they come from, like Beldum from Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, that has not even done stuff like that. What excuse do the main six have? I can't with this episode anymore. Somehow I feel that though the writers may have had the right idea in not making Rarity the character of focus in this episode, making Applejack who Spike would serve makes it basically impossible to take anything in this episode seriously. If Spike at Your Service received a more thorough rewrite, I might be able to actually like this episode outside of liking it ironically. The story falls apart alarmingly quickly, and the message does not work because of how the characters themselves act within it. About the only good thing I can say about this episode is that the imagery is actually not awful. The Timberwolves actually look decent in CGI, and there's some good attention to detail with the shading, like when Spike is under the bucket. Besides that, the only thing I could really say about this episode that I liked was that it was so bad that I could not stop laughing at it when I was watching it. And here's the rub. If I was to call this a nightmare episode, it would be in my worst fight for the entire show as of Season 7. Easy. But because the episode itself does not take itself seriously, I'd feel really guilty if I did. And like with Over a Barrel, I do see a good story buried in here somewhere. It's just a shame that it had to be Applejack and not Rarity, even though Rarity could have very well made this a worse episode. But as its own product, I still had fun, so I'm calling it a dream episode. I will give you credit. Of all episodes I've seen in this show, none to my knowledge can come across as this bizarrely entertaining. It may be worse structured than something like No Second Francis or Dragon Quest, but Spike at Your Service doesn't piss me off, it makes me laugh. And sometimes, especially now more than ever before, that's all you can really ask for. It's an honest-to-God spectacle. Episode 62, Keep Calm and Flutter On. Princess Celestia tasks the main six with Discord's reformation with Fluttershy taking the lead. Well, this was a very interesting episode to revisit considering my previous stance on it. What do I mean by that? Originally, I called this episode good, but I was very much hesitant to, and that's because the ending of this episode gave me a lot of unease, and I really wasn't very sure about how Discord's reformation really worked as far as whether it was organic or not. I'll talk more about that later, but I want to start from the beginning of this episode for now. As far as the introduction, I'm not a very big fan of it. Celestia seeking for the main six to help out in reforming Discord just comes clear out of nowhere, and there really isn't an argument being made as to how Discord's magic could actually be used for good. True, it's not necessarily evil how the magic is used, at least regarding how he actually uses it on Ponyville, but then you get how his magic was used against the main six, and yeah, this does not really make any sense at all. We have to give the foresight in knowing that the magic would have actually been used against T-Rex because of the events in It's About Time, but it wasn't like this information was known at the time this episode originally came out, and there's still absolutely no justification for Celestia to be so cryptic about it. I have more issues to do with the dialogue as well. A lot of what happened after Discord was freed from his stone prison just felt like plotting. Maybe others would find it funny, but the plot to me felt like it was really meandering when Fluttershy was threatening to use her stare against Discord, not to mention all the banter with all the rest of the main six. I really wish the scene was made shorter. Also, this is a bit of a nitpick, but whatever happened to not being able to control your stare, Fluttershy? Like, just use the stare if you're really planning on doing it. Don't threaten to use it. It just makes it a lot less impactful in my opinion. I actually thought that Rainbow Dash in particular was really bad in this episode. A lot of what she says is just so awkward, like giving Discord a reminder to something that he did in an earlier episode, as if he genuinely forgot. Twilight is also just really horrible in this episode. There's a scene where she's actually trying to find a reforming spell because she wants to basically erase Discord's personality and rewrite it to something that she actually wants him to be, just in case Fluttershy actually fails, and I'm here like, that's horrible. Unironically, that would be a fate worse than death. And this scene is interlaced with Discord just eating paper, so you know that not very much time could have passed as this was happening. And that leads to another problem I have with this episode, and it's just that the pacing is really bad. Over the course of the story, it feels like Fluttershy managed to reform Discord in only a single afternoon. But how the scenes are all structured in between Fluttershy and Discord actually interacting with each other, it makes it abundantly clear that not a lot of time has actually passed at all. First, you have Twilight and the rest of her friends going to her house to look for a backup plan. In the next scene, we have a transition, but it just shows Discord eating paper. We then cut back to Twilight and her company looking for a reforming spell, which would also very heavily imply that not much time has actually passed since Discord started eating paper. And when we cut back to Discord, he's just now finishing the paper he was eating, and he's making a mess of Fluttershy's cottage, all the while buttering her up by making her believe that he really is getting better, despite the fact that we, the audience, are already very well aware of the fact that he's lying through his teeth. We're later shown that Fluttershy actually believes this, which we know by the fact that she's telling her friends what Discord told her, and then from there cut to commercial. The way this is formatted, it feels like very little time actually passed in between Discord and Fluttershy being together, and Fluttershy believing that Discord is really coming around, and it as a result makes Fluttershy read as extremely naive. I've heard some take issue with the idea that Discord was able to be reformed after a single afternoon. My problem actually has more to do with the fact that Fluttershy genuinely feels that progress has been made after a matter of minutes. It would actually be more believable if it really did feel like an entire afternoon passed, as opposed to what feels like 15 minutes tops. So yeah, on an overall basic level, I have a lot of problems with this episode's structure. On a lighter note, however, I do think that Discord all the same is still plenty entertaining. There's a lot of fun visuals, though of course he has to be more restrained because he's on Fluttershy's watch. I do enjoy seeing him beat Angel around though, that's always a plus. But the sad thing is that beyond him bullying Angel, there really isn't much about this episode I like about it. It's during the dinner time scene where Discord goes from basically playing Fluttershy to genuinely valuing her as a friend. And the scene tries to sell me on believing that Discord really does feel comfortable around Fluttershy because Fluttershy has accepted him for being more chaotic. But that's a lot harder to sell when Discord has gone on record already saying that he's playing Fluttershy for a fool. It's a really nasty case of tell don't show where Discord is talking to Angel and telling him this stuff, when we the audience could have very well interpreted that by how he was messing with the main six during the dinner party. It really does just feel to me like this episode doesn't really have much confidence in the viewer to be able to pick up on what's actually happening. And the sad thing is that if the episode didn't do that, we could have been left questioning how Discord is really feeling about Fluttershy. As is, when Fluttershy calls out Rainbow Dash for believing that she's some kind of silly gullible fool, it's really hard to not see Fluttershy as such, because the evidence is overwhelmingly pointing in that direction. By the time Discord really does start to value Fluttershy, it feels contrived, because the episode already went out of its way to tell me that he's using Fluttershy as a means to an end. So him developing genuine feelings for her feels like it comes clear out of nowhere. I feel like if Discord wasn't so obvious as far as him trying to play Fluttershy as a fool, like he's taking his chance to have some fun, but otherwise, he's just trying to get a read as to what angle Fluttershy is trying to attack him by, because, you know, he's under the impression that he's only here because Celestia wants him reformed. The moment where Discord finally comes around would have felt a lot more organic. As it stands now, Discord's reformation doesn't really work for me, and that right there is this episode's death knell. If you can get past that, a lot of Fluttershy's actions otherwise do make a fair bit of sense. Originally, I had a problem with the fact that Fluttershy never let her friends in on what she was doing, but if we're being realistic, not telling them made their reactions actually genuine, and it would make the way that Fluttershy is actually trying to manipulate Discord be a lot more strong. Because in seeing how frustrated Fluttershy's friends are, he really does believe that she's genuine here. I can see the argument being made and how Discord is still fully in control of the objects he's animating for the tea party, but it isn't all too out there that they can still have their own ego and be able to act independently of Discord. And even barring that, it is really funny how they bounce off the main six. Though Fluttershy's comment where she calls all her friends for not giving Discord a chance is utter horseradish, because Pinkie Pie and the Gravy Boat at least got along really well with each other. I have to say though, I find the revelation that Fluttershy drops in that she's only being nice to Discord so that she can effectively control him to be really freaking cold. And honestly, I kinda like this. This is a show where friendship has been used as a tangible weapon of war, but Fluttershy is weaponizing friendship on a much more dastardly level, using kindness as leverage, and it really gives Discord's actions after Fluttershy surrenders her element to use against him, feeling like he's no longer free, but rather under new management. I mean, I could complain about this, what with Fluttershy actually threatening power over Discord by threatening to stop being his friend if he doesn't do what she says, which would definitely make this feel very one-sided as a friendship, if you could even call it that. And again, I'm not looking to future episodes for confirmation that she's not lying, so I'm sorry, no three's a crowd. But Discord did get Fluttershy to forfeit her element of harmony to use against him, and she did keep true to her word, so it's not entirely as one-sided as some may believe it is. And I find this to be a very important detail because it does help make it so that Fluttershy doesn't feel quite as manipulative. She has in a sense demonstrated that friendship is about give and take doing that. And that is a moral I can get behind. Not the most original moral for this show considering Sisterhood of Social came before it, but I think for this episode the execution is okay enough. So admittedly, I have a lot of problems with this episode all the same. Bad pacing, most of the characters are really bad. The setup and build up to Discord actually being reformed feels entirely unnatural. And this episode as a whole really feels like it was written as a fan fiction to see Discord be integrated into the main cast. Which, funnily enough, that's because that's actually the truth. This is actually someone's own fan fiction that was made into its own episode in the show. Which, while really cool, is also very much showing us the lack of quality in the episode's writing. On the bright side, there was some decent humor. The moral is alright. We got some cool imagery out of Discord. And though I cannot by any means call this a good episode, I do think there is just enough to like about it where I can call it a low okay. Though if you wanted to call this episode bad, I would not blame you whatsoever, because there are a lot of problems with it. In fact, I would not be surprised if I was too nice to this episode. Episode 63, Just for Sidekicks. Spike pet sits the main six sidekicks while they're at the Crystal Empire. And by sidekicks, I mean their pets. In a lot of respects, this feels like a companion piece to Season 2's episode Secret of My Excess. An episode that gave us more insight on dragon biology, but didn't really do much to make them look any better than they did before. This episode actually uses the fact that dragons like Spike are prone to greed the more they have, as the driving force for the conflict in this episode. And if you couldn't already imagine, that means that Spike isn't going to be a very likable character in this story. Let's just cut to the chase. I did not enjoy this episode. I understand that it's the point that Spike is a jerk in this episode, and there's nothing really wrong with that. It's okay for a character to be a jerk in an episode that revolves around the character being a jerk and learning a lesson for it. The problem though is that for as long as Spike has been watching over the pets, he really hasn't had much of a chance to really screw up in watching them. From the moment that Spike regains consciousness and tries to take control of the situation, Angel already dipped out of Twilight's library, and the rest of the episode is just spent trying to get him back. Yeah, Spike does say a lot that he's just focusing on the jewel cake, but I feel that doing that, this episode actually falls into a very similar trap to Owl's World that ends well. That episode had Spike constantly narrating his feelings surrounding Aloysius, and this episode has him constantly narrating that he only wants to focus on the jewel cake. But despite that, Spike has done very little actually wrong. He's still making a very genuine effort to watch over the pets. Obviously his mind isn't really set on actually watching them because he wants to focus on the cake, But as far as what's shown, there's really only one scene that I believe does that, and that's where he drops the pets off at the CMC to go on and then do his own thing. And even then, Spike gave up doing that when he believed that Tank had his head cut off. This plot I feel would have worked much better if we saw Spike actually trying to make more cake batter as the animals were demanding his attention. You know, for a plot that's about how Spike is being neglectful of the sidekicks, you should probably show Spike being neglectful of the sidekicks. It's not enough for Spike to cut a deal with his friends that he does not intend to honor. Okay, harboring bad thoughts is not the same thing as acting on bad thoughts. And likewise, it's not like bad actions can be excused by good intentions. There's also just a lot of little things in this episode that really bother me, like the fact that Spike is always carrying the gems on him at all times, even though he already has in mind that he only wants the gems for the cake that he wants to bake. What do I mean by this? You know how when Angel ran off, Spike and the pets went to chase after him? For some reason, despite the fact that Spike only wants to use the gems on the cake, he takes the gems with him even though he wants to use them only later. So it ends up being awfully convenient when he finds Angel with the CMC, and just so happened to have gems on him to pay Apple Bloom with. Not only that, but following leaving the pets with the CMC, he goes into the town to get some supplies to make more cake batter. But over the course of the episode, we see that he still had 5 gems left over, so he didn't need the gems to buy the ingredients. And bear in mind, all the ingredients that Spike went on to buy in town went to waste when he checked on the pets. And at the end of the episode, he already had batter prepared despite not having the opportunity to make more. So what was the point of going into town if you already had the batter prepared and you could have baked the cake? There was no point in Spike doing any of that beyond realizing the mistake in letting the CMC watch over the pets that he was in charge of. It feels like a really big plot hole in the episode, considering that if Spike never went into town, he could have went straight back home to prepare the cake. Regarding how Sakura loses one of Spike's gems for him, I know there's an in-universe reason why Sakura is doing it, but again, it doesn't really make sense for Spike to have the gems on him still. And it isn't like it's inherently bad for Spike to have stuff for himself. It's kind of jerkish to make him lose something that was rightfully his, considering he was paid to do it. And really, for a plot like this, I want Spike to lose things due to things that are his own fault. But what happened so far beyond what happened with the CMC was not his fault. So instead of wanting to see Spike learn a lesson from this, it just feels like Princess Spike, where the punishment that someone's enduring doesn't really feel deserved or warranted. And instead, I feel myself feeling kind of bad for Spike because it just feels like you're kicking a man when he's down. Granted, this episode isn't as bad as that one. In Princess Spike, he didn't do anything selfish until after Cadence called him out. While in Just For Sidekicks, he loses the first jewel he had to doing something selfish. It's just a shame that that one selfish action didn't really build on anything. Not anything we were concretely shown at least. I know previous episodes existed, like for example Dragonshy, where Spike was watching Fluttershy's animals. But beyond doing it to help, there was no incentive for Spike to do it. And generally for the purposes of this story, unless explicitly mentioned, we shouldn't have to look to another episode for information. Besides, as far as that episode is concerned, the only thing I could really derive from it is that Angel and Spike have a history with each other and they don't like each other. And to me at least, that says very little. Definitely no more regarding what Spike says at the end of the episode when he's apologizing to Angel. Like, at no point did Spike ever ignore Angel. In fact, Spike has been repeatedly shown chasing after Angel, and beyond one single moment with the CMC, never really had a chance to fluff his tail either. Most of what Spike admits to here isn't even his fault. And this isn't even getting into the fact that Spike is talking about this while he and the animals, and the CMC for that matter, are all underneath the main 6 as they all finish boarding the train on their way back home. For all intents and purposes, it doesn't really make sense how Spike didn't get caught here. Yes, I know he was whispering, which Winona and Sweetie Belle didn't do, but I'm gonna come out and say it. They made Applejack just really dumb in this scene. I get that it's a cartoon, but realistically speaking, I do not think that for a second that Applejack could have really thought that her hooves were barking. I think I would have preferred if she commented on the cushions instead. Yet, to be frank, there really isn't anything about this episode that I like about it. Some things I found mildly amusing, like the main 6 having fun with their pets, and maybe the pet's reaction to Angel being called the cutest thing by Sweetie Belle, but everything else just did not do it for me. Meanwhile, I have a lot of problems with this episode. I personally found it really boring. Spike isn't likable, but I also don't think that he really deserves what happens to him. The moral that Spike recounts feels incongruent with what we saw earlier in the story. Very little about this episode felt memorable at all, and narratively, it's full of plot holes. It's a nightmare episode! Oh yeah, they hand-waved Pee-wee being in this episode by having him be returned to his family from Dragon Quest. Wow, they really did want to bury that turd, didn't they? Episode 64. Games Ponies Play. The main six welcomes the Games Inspector of the Equestria Games. So this episode is intended to be an alternate perspective of what actually happened during the events of Just for Sidekicks. As a matter of fact, this episode ends with us seeing Spike and the CMC as well as all the pets being underneath the seats of the main six. As if this was meant to be a cliffhanger, despite the fact that the episode we saw previously already showed us the end result and it ended up being all just fine. That's a very perplexing decision on the show's part. I have to question why do that instead of having Games Ponies Play be the first episode and Just for Sidekicks being the second. This episode is largely centered around the entire main six, but it strangely feels the most focused around Rainbow Dash, even though we spend a lot of time on Twilight's perspective. I can't quite find the vocabulary to explain what I'm thinking when I see this, but for lack of a better word, I found it very confusing. Meanwhile, Applejack and Fluttershy have their roles be very much subdued, and Pinkie Pie was mostly alright, at least before she just started making funny faces like we're only 7. Okay, at least with the Cake Twins it made sense because they were only babies. This is a full-grown mare. I'm not one to tell people to act their age, but Pinkie Pie should at least be able to recognize that this is not very tone appropriate. However, my biggest problem with this episode is just how unnatural it feels when the main six get the wrong pony. The only thing that Twilight and her friends go off of is that Miss Harshwinnie has a floral suitcase. And that is literally it. There's no information on her mane, there's no information on her coat, her cutie mark, her eye color, nothing but her freaking suitcase. A description so non-descriptive that it's honestly baffling. But believe it or not, that's not even the biggest problem with how the main six get confused. This description I could see making sense in context of the episode if it was justified by, say, having Miss Harshwinnie be in disguise when she arrived in the Crystal Empire. Like if she was a hub inspector or something. However, I don't think that really would make very much sense, considering that Harshwinnie is supposed to meet Cadance later in the story. But that just screams to how ridiculous it is that Twilight gives her friends so little to go off of as far as how to identify Miss Harshwinnie. And so for the majority of this episode, the main six barring Rarity are just really stupid. So much of what happened in this episode could have been avoided if Twilight went up to the Mustang and stated, "You must be Miss Harshwinnie." And after hearing that, she was wondering what Twilight was even talking about. After all, that's only common courtesy. You start with names and go from there. At the very least, if you're gonna have Rainbow Dash be this unbelievably neurotic, lean into that. All of the mind games that Rainbow Dash is considering to happen don't really have any relevance to the story. All the while, Twilight and her friends look painfully oblivious to what's just common sense. But you know something? Even with this goof, this episode was up beyond saving. Because even though how the main six confused Miss Harshwinnie for another pony feels really contrived, this episode could have still been okay had we been given a good reason for Miss Harshwinnie to believe that the Crystal Empire was actually worth hosting the games at. We understand that she wants an authentic greeting from the Crystal Empire. She got no greeting whatsoever. But other things could have happened to her to justify in her mind why the Equestria Games could have still been hosted here. You could have had moments where Twilight was seeing Miss Harshwinnie struggle to carry her luggage, and instead of just saying hello, have Twilight help. You know, actions that wouldn't make her feel entirely invisible. Because as it stands, the Crystal Empire does not appear as a very alluring place to visit. Especially that when people can plainly see you struggling, you get splashed with water on 2 different occasions. It just rings to an extreme lack of hospitality. It also just makes it really hard to swallow when Miss Harshwinnie hears from the Mustang that the main six were with the entire day, just how warm a reception she's gotten as a visitor. Like, Rainbow Dash earlier already confessed to Cadance in front of Harshwinnie that they gave the welcome wagon to the wrong pony. So obviously how she was treated would have to come with a lot of bias. Also, they gave that pony that kind of a greeting, and you didn't get that at all. Yet you're under the belief that that was a genuine greeting that she was given. Wouldn't that serve to make her extremely skeptical of the intentions of the welcome, considering how grand of a welcome this random mare got, but you got basically none whatsoever? That's a gaping leap in logic, and a really bad plot hole that needs to be filled. In fact, I'd probably be questioning the intelligence of the main six if they legitimately believed that this pony was supposed to be me. Nothing about how this episode's resolution happens makes any sense whatsoever, and it ends up being a downright fatal flaw. If you move past what the episode is mainly about, it is a fair bit better though. I found Twilight's ability to compose herself thanks to Cadence to be really cute. And it was nice to have an episode where basically everything went wrong for Twilight, being thrown curveball after curveball, and yet she's still able to remain fairly tempered. Good character development. Of course, it's also hindered by the fact that Rainbow Dash is still being erotic for her, so for this episode it feels like a case of give and take. Regarding the Mustang, I don't know if the episode actually gives her a name, I don't remember if it did. I thought a lot of her scenes were also just really fun. From what I remember though, Mustangs are by nature claustrophobic, so how she's always acting kooky while indoors, it makes a lot of sense. However, doing a quick Google search actually told me that all horses are claustrophobic. I don't know, but either way, this tangent really isn't either here or there. She still manages to have a lot of really funny scenes, like when she's actually running off with a racetrack and she ends up managing to sling Rainbow Dash into the glass where Cadence and Rarity are. That's something to appreciate about this episode. Not every joke lands for me, but I do appreciate the attempts at humor. Whether that'll save this episode from being a nightmare, I'm sorry to say that it really doesn't. The plot is still entirely nonsensical and extremely confusing. The characters, especially Rainbow Dash, are characterized really poorly. The ending makes absolutely no sense, and the moral almost feels entirely detached from what the episode itself was actually about. How about, instead of commenting on the joys of giving someone something you've always wanted but never could actually have, speak on the importance of treating everyone hospitably, whether they're important or they're not. It would be more relevant and would have actually saved this episode from being a, say it with me now, 3, 2, 1, nightmare episode! Yeah, both this and Just For Sidekicks in my opinion are bad episodes. And considering how the rest of this arc will play out in Season 4, I'd say this arc as a whole does not have very good odds of not being a total bust. But to end on a more positive note, it was pretty cool to see Rainbow Dash's father before parental guidance, and a few scenes involving Cadence and Rarity I also thought were really fun to watch. Rarity's comment on trying to save Cadence's mane also I thought was just very interesting when looked alongside It Isn't the Main Thing About You. It may not get me to call that episode good, but I think Rarity talking about saving Cadence's mane is still an important detail if I ever want to revisit Season 7. It's just a shame that this episode's story as a whole is so bad. And don't worry, I have not forgotten about the fact that Spike was not invited to the Crystal Empire, and they actually addressed that in Just For Sidekicks. It left me wondering, why did they not invite Spike, considering that he's responsible for saving the Crystal Empire? I mean, I know the reason why, because I have the gift of foresight, but at the time this episode came out, no, it's confusing. Episode 65, Magical Mystery Cure. An unfinished spell distorts the destinies of Twilight's friends, leaving her to course correct. This episode feels really grand, which is only to be expected because it is a season bookend after all. But it was also originally written as if it was the final episode of the show, at least that's what I remember hearing. But if you ask me, it really shows, because this really feels like a celebration of everything that's happened before. Not only are there a ton of callbacks to previous episodes, but the story of this episode really demands that you pay attention to what happened before it as well. Essentially, Twilight cast an unfinished spell that she got from Princess Celestia that was written by Star Swirl the Bearded, and that spell sent all of Twilight's friends' destinies into disarray. It's worth remembering that it is about time. We have seen that Star Swirl has actually dabbled in magic that involves time travel. So this spell is very likely in that case linked to that, as it has to be able to rewrite history in order to achieve the effect that it has, which I think is absolutely fascinating, when also combined with Rarity's dialogue where she was under the belief that her whole life has been spent doing whatever Rainbow Dash has been doing, which has been managing the weather, which I regret to say is not exactly accurate. Rainbow Dash got her cutie mark from racing and being really fast, but her passion is not being a weather pony. So that is a continuity error, but as far as I understand, that's the only continuity error in this episode. And with how much this episode calls back to previous episodes, that's actually really impressive in my opinion. Still, that's a shame, because with how much Rarity hates getting dirty, I can only imagine how miserable she'd be having to try running for the gold, and having to deal with not only dirt, but sweat. Because Rarity is anything but athletic. And even then, Call of the Cutie established that cutie marks are largely up to the interpretation of whoever gets them. So we really could have focused more on the cloud and how that has to do with the weather, rather than the lightning bolt that's about speed. In which case, it's still a continuity error, but it feels more like a missed opportunity rather than a plot hole. Meanwhile, Rainbow Dash in Fluttershy's role, she hates being grounded, but she'd have to be able to care for Fluttershy's animals. Fluttershy, meanwhile, has severe anxiety issues, and doesn't do well in public spaces, so trying to make other ponies laugh would be very difficult for her. Pinkie Pie, while she loves her family, she despises labor and farm work, so Applejack's life would be brutal for her. And Applejack as a pony has always favored practicality over fashion, so it's a no-brainer that she would hate living Rarity's life. You know, it's really clever how this was all handled, because it really makes it out as if the main six are living their worst lives possible under the spell that Twilight cast. I also really like how this episode goes out of its way to establish how Twilight cannot directly save her friends from their fates. I mean, this episode actually goes out of its way to debunk why the memory spell that was used in Return of Harmony, or the flower that Zecora used to get the truth out of Apple Bloom in the Cutie Pox would not work here. The only real way out would be to discover their true selves, and for the main six to learn for themselves that you should not just blindly follow your destiny. And I really appreciate that. It's refreshing when the answer cannot be as simple as just magic it away. This episode really had to delve into the characters and what makes them really tick. And on this note, I love how Fluttershy was the first pony that was actually looked to help. Because as we see from the Cutie Mark Chronicles, she and Rainbow Dash actually have the deepest history with each other, so she'd be best equipped to help Rainbow Dash with whatever she's suffering from, and then everything else from there is pretty self-explanatory. For that matter, I know I already went off about how Rainbow Dash's calling doesn't actually involve the weather, it's more about going fast. But like I also said before, this episode has a ton of references to previous episodes. And whether intentional or not, I think it's interesting how this episode actually has Rainbow Dash clear the weather in less than 10 seconds flat, which not only would be a pretty subtle callback to Friendship is Magic Part 1, but in a way, that would also reflect Rainbow Dash's love for speed, which actually would line up with how she got her cutie mark in the first place, in addition to just being really clever. There's lots of other really minor callbacks to previous episodes that I really like. Applejack's verse in What My Cutie Mark Is Telling Me resembles Art of the Dress from Suited for Success, for example. Twilight actually brings up that before the events of the episode, Spike was having another of his 7-hour bubble baths, which we first heard from in Party of One. Pinkie Pie's mane once again is deflated, which matches her original appearance and deposition back when she was working on a rock farm. Heck, you could probably even argue that the checkerboard pattern that Rarity was making in the sky resembles the checkerboard pattern that Discord created when he Discorded Ponyville, except what Discord did was on the ground, what Rarity did was in the air. That might be a stretch, but heck it, I think it's worth bringing up. Oh, and who could forget when the spark appeared in Twilight's eyes, like it did in Friendship is Magic Part 2. So yeah, at this episode's core, I love all the references, and I really like the story in this episode too. However, if there was anything about this episode I wanted to critique, it'd probably be the pacing. But you know, the pacing doesn't really bother me as much as it used to. I think it goes really fast, but comparatively speaking, I found that episodes like A Cancelat Wedding and The Crystal Empire feel kind of slow. There are moments in both of those episodes which really feel bogged down for various reasons, like when Chrysalis was monologuing about her plan with the changelings, or when the main six were trying to distract the Crystal Ponies from the impending doom surrounding King Sombra. They just felt like moments where the plot just stopped progressing. In fact, in rewatching these two-parters, it actually makes me really appreciate how this episode was able to be condensed into only 22 minutes, and it also makes the decision to make this episode a musical a very smart one. Not only do I like just about every song in this episode, especially Celestia's ballad and A True Friend, but the songs themselves do a lot of heavy lifting to really keep this plot on the move. So the pace feels fast, but it doesn't feel too fast. And as I've learned from later two-parters, if there's not enough plot to sustain a full 44 minutes, just make it 22. I may not be a big fan of Celestial advice, but I still appreciate the fact that it's only 22 minutes long as opposed to Shadowplay or The Crystalling. This is all to say, I really appreciate how Magical Mystery Cure was written given all of this. Now as for the last third of this episode where Twilight becomes an Alicorn princess, I personally feel this scene was handled absolutely beautifully. A disclaimer though, I've actually heard this was a very unpopular decision back when this episode first came out, and it leaves me really wondering what the fandom was like back when this show was still airing new episodes. Especially during the Megan McCarthy era because I wasn't really involved in it. all I can really say was that my very first episode of the show was Castlemania, which was season 4. So Alicorn Twilight was just something I accepted because that's the first I've ever known her. But unlike Spike and Spike at Your Service, looking back at Magical Mystery Cure, I have absolutely no objections to Twilight becoming a princess now. First of all, this entire episode has been bringing up just the past for Twilight and the show, and how she's been progressively learning more and more as time has gone on, to really set the stage of just how far she's managed to come leading up to now. And I feel this episode makes a great argument in favor of saying that Twilight should progress and not just be a static character. And making her a princess would be an interesting step forward, I believe. Because as Celestia herself has said, she's no longer going to be the student. She's going to become a teacher now. And having the gift of foresight, it is fascinating how this show managed to capitalize on this direction. She's taken the role of a missionary, spreading her teachings far and wide to distant locations. She has her own student now, and that will come with its own hardships. It does a lot to really make you feel proud of Twilight and see how far she's come. But most importantly, I feel like this also does a fantastic job completing the message of this episode, which initially is saying you shouldn't just blindly follow your destiny, but it's also saying that you shouldn't blindly turn away from it either. Twilight's friends were blindly following their destinies and they were miserable doing it. Twilight herself, however, sees her destiny going in this direction. And this episode has gone to great lengths to show us that Twilight following her destiny in this direction is the right call. With that in mind, this episode really feels like a complete package. It's not perfect, but I think it's very close to perfect. And it's definitely a good episode in my opinion. If this was how the show had ended, I don't think I'd complain. It's a good finale. And between its story, its characters, and the emotions that it manages to bring out, I can confidently say this is one of my favorite episodes in the entire show. An absolutely spectacular showstopper. And that is every episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic Season 3 Revisited. In total, there were 5 episodes I consider good, 2 episodes I would consider okay, 4 episodes I'd call bad, and 1 episode that I am calling a guilty pleasure. Now, much like Seasons 1 and 2, I do think that the ratings are noticeably lower for Season 3, but I think it actually goes a fair bit deeper than that. Though like the previous seasons, there are episodes I like more now than it did before, like Too Many Pinkie Pies or Magic Duel. No episodes in Season 3 actually see their ratings to be improved, unless you want to count Spike at Your Service, which was originally a nightmare episode, but I now consider it a guilty pleasure. Meanwhile, several episodes actually have worse ratings this time around. Wonderbolts Academy and Keep Calm and Flutter are both no longer good episodes in my opinion, and are now just okay. Meanwhile, Games Ponies Play is no longer an okay episode, I consider it a nightmare, and Just For Sidekicks in this respect really fell off. And you may have noticed something else because of the new ratings that these episodes have gotten, but the season as a whole is actually fairly close to even now. Meaning Season 3 I no longer consider to be a good season, I consider it to be just okay. To be fair, there were a lot of things working against it. This is the first season under Megan McCarthy's direction, where Seasons 1 and 2 were under the direction of Lauren Faust. So it stands to reason that right now, the show is trying to find its footing. Even then, I'd hardly consider Season 3 to be bad. If anything, I just think it's kind of average. And I still appreciate the attempts to try having more serialized stories actually making sense. For example, Season 1 had the Grind Galloping Gala, which I thought was actually fairly decent for what it was. And for that arc, I appreciate how the show actually took its time to really establish the gala and didn't just blindside us with that. Likewise, Season 3 does a lot of heavy lifting to really justify Magical Mystery Cure's existence with the Crystal Empire and then Keep Calm and Flutter on, not to mention the entire show leading up to the finale. It's a fair bit more enjoyable than, say, a Cancelout Wedding having Twilight's brother and her old full sitter just appear out of nowhere. At the end of it all, I still liked Season 3 for what it was. It didn't hit the highs of Season 2 or even Season 1 in my opinion, but even the worst of Season 3 is not nearly as bad as the worst of Season 2, and it definitely did not flop nearly as often as Season 1, even if you were to account for the fact that Season 1 proportionately would have more chances to flop. And that about does it for my notes on Season 3 actually. So without further ado, there's only one way we can really end this video, and that's going over my worst and best 5 episodes of Season 3. But I also want to do something different this time around. Since there's only 12 episodes, 13 if you consider both halves of the Crystal Empire, instead of making a worst and best 5 for Season 3, I instead want to talk about every episode in order from worst to best, because really, why the heck not? It's not that much extra work, and I want to make this feel as complete as possible. To start, I want to talk about Spike at Your Service. Now, the quality of writing for this episode in particular is so bad that I would honestly consider it to be the worst episode in Season 3. But I'm going to excuse this episode from this list, because as awful as I truly believe this episode to be, it almost feels wrong to really hate it. But if you want to hear where this episode would have actually ranked had I included it, just keep watching this list, you'll hear about it when I get to it. So 11th place in Season 3 has to be Apple Family Reunion. This is an episode I find just thoroughly unenjoyable from start to finish. Applejack is just not a likable character, and her behaviors in this episode had me range from feeling just frustrated with her to genuinely uncomfortable. To say nothing of how her family is shown to try dealing with her. Just a thoroughly bad story. 10th place, One Bad Apple. I really feel like this episode came from a good place, but the third act and the execution of the moral really betrays it. I'd rank it lower, but the song Bab Sees really does slap. 9th place, Games Ponies Play. Some mildly funny moments, but unfortunately, they're stuck in a story that makes absolutely no sense, with the intelligence of the main six being well below the norm. I actually feel myself becoming dumber after watching this episode. 8th place, Just For Sidekicks. Another episode I just do not consider enjoyable, compounded by the fact that I do not believe that Spike is nearly as in the wrong as this episode wants me to believe that he is. Not the worst Spike episode, but far from the best. Now, if I was rating episodes by how much I enjoy them, the very next episode I would talk about would be Spike at Your Service. But since that episode is exempt, let us continue. 7th place goes to Keep Calm and Flutter On. There's a lot of really bad characterization, and the way that the writing is handled really feels like it's talking down to its audience. The only reason it's not lower on this list is because I think that Fluttershy's portrayal is actually really funny in the third act. Pardon my cringe, but gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss. And it's here we find ourselves into the actual good half of Season 3, with 6th place being Wonderbolts Academy. I may not be all too big on this episode nowadays, but I do still respect it for what it tried to do. Rainbow Dash is still a fantastic character, and the moral is absolutely admirable. It just could have really benefited from having better pacing. 5th best, The Crystal Empire. Admittedly, it has a very disappointing villain in King Sombra, but this episode is still saved by having a good story and very well handled characters. And above all else, Spike is getting the respect that he deserves. Who can be angry at that? 4th best, Too Many Pinkie Pies. In addition to good humor, this has Pinkie Pie at some of her best, and makes a great case as to why she's such a likable character. Not to mention teaching her a moral that I believe that she really needed to learn. 3rd place, Sleepless in Ponyville. Definitely a contender for one of the best stories in Season 3. Solid humor, good characterization, a very touching resolution, and even some much needed spotlight for Princess Luna this time around. Overall, fantastic episode. 2nd place, you might be surprised to see this, Magical Mystery Cure. Of all of the season bookends in the first 3 seasons, this has got to be my favorite one. It's full of good songs. The story is constantly on the move, meaning there's just never a moment to really get bored while watching it. The episode is beautifully animated, and at the end of it all, I just feel proud of Twilight. It's hard to put into words just how happy this episode makes me feel, but I truly do love it. And this leads us into number 1, my favorite episode of Season 3, Magic Duel. Beyond the few nitpicks I have with this episode, I adore it. The feud between Trixie and Twilight is beyond entertaining, with some great jokes sprinkled in at the same time. Trixie herself especially is just an absolute riot in this episode. It's chock full of just really fun imagery, and even the way that the villain is defeated feels like the best we've ever seen in the entire show up to now. Genuinely, I find this to be a very smart episode. And though it was close between this and Magical Mystery Cure, I feel confident in declaring this one my favorite. And with that, now you know my opinion on Season 3 of Friendship is Magic. And I want to apologize, because when I first made my Season 3 video, I actually never included a worst or best list. And that's because at the time, I was actually fairly mixed on Season 3. Keep in mind, this was during a time where I was too afraid to really hold my own opinions. But even then, Season 3 genuinely left me mystified, and I didn't actually know how I would order the episodes because they kinda just meshed together in my mind. Whereas at least with Season 1, I always knew that I Was All That Ends Well was a really bad episode, and I always believed that Dragon Quest was just horrible. But Season 3 didn't really have anything else too clear on either front, worst or best. But hey, now that I've grown to being my own person, I feel comfortable giving my own opinion now. And I hope you enjoyed this video and listening to it. Now, the logical step forward from this point onward is to probably go to Season 4, but right now what I want to do is actually continue one where I left off before, because the last season I reviewed before revisiting seasons was Season 7. Meaning the next video I make reviewing a season will be reviewing Season 8 for the first time. And here's the rub. If Season 8 ends up being as bad as I fear it will be because of what I've heard about it, I may not even go to Season 9 right away after finishing Season 8, and I'll come back to Season 4 to revisit that instead. And maybe even Season 5 for that matter. But until next time, I'll see you in Season 8. This is Orantula. Thank you for watching.